Okay. So here we are the last week. I want to finish up talking about policy evaluation. We picked up on last Thursday, and then I want to turn to the subject of future challenges facing public policy, most of which I think really peers directly off of this discussion about evaluation and how we deal with the possibility of policy failure and how we can ensure policy success. I want to pick up where we left off Thursday last by talking about what we have learned about policy success, what can be done to make policies work better. Obviously, in looking through these admonishments, they're all pretty complicated. If they were easy, we probably wouldn't have policy failure. They're a constant struggle. They're a constant need for reconciling a lot of things that are really very, very difficult to achieve, no doubt about it. But the key is that we need to design policies, and we realize this, and a lot of people in the policy community realize it. We need to design policies adaptively. We need to encompass the possibility that they will fail. And if that's true, then we have to embrace temporal, spatial, perceptual, and goal-based failures right at the beginning. We began talking about some of the ways we can do this, and we'll use some examples of situations where they have actually been used. But I want to revisit these because they really are very difficult things to do. They're huge political challenges. This notion of error-provocative design, Bruce Ackerman and Frank Robeson back in the 80s and 90s did some of the earliest work on this subject of error-provocative design. These are scholars that are particularly interested in technology policies, or policies that have technological or scientific implications, which could range all the way from the space program we talked about last week, to energy policy, to even nutrition, public health policies. And an error-provocative design assumes, again, that failure is probably inevitable at some level. And so what we want to do is, given the interest group pressures in the design of policies and the fact that policies are often hastily created, is you want to prepare for these flaws by providing checks and balances. What does checks and balances mean? Well, we think of checks and balances going way back to the beginning of the course in democratic policymaking as meaning that government itself is structured in such a way that different interests can check and balance the power of other interests. That's integral to the American system of politics. But this is something else. This is something much deeper. This is saying not checks and balances within the government or within the political process. It's saying within the policy, within the actual law, regulation, program, what have you, that at the first sign of a problem, a street-level bureaucrat can actually intervene to veto a decision, to, in fact, oversee or overturn something that his or her boss may have decided on. Demand that some problem be inspected, audited, examined, evaluated, and revisited. And in addition to the checks and balances, then permit input from a wide range of people outside of the policy, the consumers. You, as the subject of the policy, can actually complain, not just lodge a complaint, but actually have some authority to make sure that the policy is revisited or modified in some way. This is a huge leap of faith for the way public policies are usually made. Before I go any further, let me just ask a somewhat rhetorical question. Would these be easy things to implement? Could you imagine most organizations in the public sector saying, oh sure, we'll design a policy so that anyone can be a whistleblower. You've all heard the expression whistleblower. We embrace that. We welcome that. Go ahead and rat us out. What do you think? these things that are pretty difficult to achieve? Why? Some of it's commonsensical, but it's probably worth stating. Why is it difficult? Organizations don't like to admit they make mistakes, right? It's a sign of failure. If you fail, then it usually means that your budget might be subject to reduction or somebody's career might be on the line. Any other reasons? Just knowing how policy organizations work in general.
I think that actually public policy itself has a relatively low, short history. So it still needs some kind of full information, and we don't know like how it works and what kind of consideration we have to consider yet.
Right.
So I think now is kind of in the beginning of the stage. So like as the time goes by, I'm thinking that we may have we can have a chance to develop the full idea, and maybe public policy can eventually succeed.
Yeah, I think that's right. All of this connotes, and I think this is what you're driving at, a very important point, all of this connotes a sharing of power and authority. It's not just ratting out your boss or vetoing a decision made by your organization. It's sharing power. It's sharing power with people within an organization at lower rungs of the policy organization. Again, that expression, street-level bureaucrat. It's sharing authority with the public. And we'll come back to this issue of public participation later today, because this is a very huge challenge in all areas of public policy worldwide. So it's sharing authority, and it's also sharing responsibility for implementing a policy. That implementing a policy is not simply the responsibility of the government. It's the responsibility of everybody involved in the process of instituting it. It's a very difficult set of challenges. So you get the picture. This is what you need to do to ensure that policies succeed. We are, I think you're correct, only at the beginning of an era when this is becoming expected, demanded, this notion of accountability. And it's a huge set of political challenges, and it's going to remain a set of political challenges well into the future. We're going to come back to this future business in a little bit. But I think this is really the cusp of some of the greatest challenges facing us. Let me mention one other thing that makes this difficult, in addition to this notion of shared authority. At some level, and we're going to come back to this a little bit in more detail, worldwide, and this is one of the points that Ellis makes in his reading in Chapter 7, worldwide, policymakers are facing a real dilemma. The dilemma is that more and more people are demanding more and more from the state, more and more from government. We want to live in a safer society, in a more risk-free society, in a society that provides greater benefits, not just basic needs, but of the quality of our lives. These are things that we seem to be demanding more and more and more of worldwide as we become more modernized, as we become more sophisticated, as the revolution of rising expectations spreads. We see this, right, in the Middle East now. These are not just political debates, they're policy debates. They're not just people saying we want to share power for the government, they're saying we want benefits from the government, right? Jobs, education, housing, healthcare, etc. As these things increase and the pressures to produce increase, what it means is that all of the possibilities for policies to failure multiply, because there's less tolerance, less patience for waiting for things to work, waiting for the ship to turn. You see this, not just in the Middle East. We see the United States in a lot of respects. The fluctuation of support for government in election cycles that are only 2 years in length. Well, we voted you in, and we're waiting for all these changes, and gosh, 24 months have gone by and nothing's happened. You know, I mean, this lack of patience. So on the one hand, you have the problem of shared authority. On the other hand, you have a lack of patience and more multiplicative demands, which create more opportunities for failure. So we'll come back to those issues separately in a little bit, but I want to spell these out. Questions about this, comments about this?
Well, related to the whole, why don't you just say up front that it's probably the fail issue.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that just causes issue when you have certain actors just pursuing power, and how are they going to get buy-in if they're starting from the beginning saying that they're going to fail? And I think that would require
right.
Them
humility and
yeah,
yeah.
And
right.
I definitely think it would be. I don't think you see it with politicians, but I think the people would probably like that.
So this isn't a riddle. This is an effort at kind of reconciling what we know. And again, this gets a little ahead of ourselves. We'll look at this when we talk about challenges to policy. But as students of planning and of policy, of social science background, if you do an experiment and you find that your results, and by an experiment I mean more broadly just collecting information on a problem, and you find that your assumptions didn't quite play out, you were in error, and you found that the data contradicted what you initially hypothesized, is that a failure? No, it's not a failure, right? In fact, it's a success. It means that you did a good job in your science. Does that work in politics? Does that reasoning work in the policy world? You know what? You guys elected me, and I went to Washington, and I thought everything was going to work this way, and sure enough, I was completely wrong. And I just want you to know that, and I want you to be elected. That doesn't work. Huh? Yeah. The dilemma between science and politics. This is one of the big future challenges. How do you create a public savvy enough about the science to accept this paradigm? Because that's what it takes. It takes basically not just a change in the policymaker establishment, it takes a change in the public to tolerate the idea that failure is not necessarily a bad thing, that policy is in effect a set of experiments, in a manner of speaking. Sally.
Yeah, I think in science, when we have these failed hypotheses, it's really sort of an opportunity to look at, like, sometimes it's because of some unknown phenomenon that you can, that came to light because of this failed hypothesis or something. So it's an opportunity to learn more about what's really going on in whatever social phenomenon. We don't really use that approach in politics at all. When we have a failed policy, it's an opportunity to see, okay, well, there's really something more going on here that we're not addressing.
Yeah, that's right. And also, as we'll see momentarily, one of the dilemmas, too, is that policy, as social scientists and as planners, when we go out and we collect information about a problem and we found that what we thought we would find isn't true, what's at stake? Our term paper, right? Our article for publication. What's at stake in a policy failure? Well, much more. There could be lives at stake. There could be welfare at stake. There could be well-being at stake. So let me push on to some concluding observations about policy failure and success. Are there examples of error-provocative design? There are a few. I give you 4, which we can discuss. They all have some commonalities. The biggest commonality is that they all came about because something went dreadfully wrong. There must be a lesson there somewhere. NASA, manned spaceflight mission. Since the space shuttle accidents, Challenger and Columbia, there have been changes in procedure in NASA, which have been practiced over the years. Among other things, in fact, in the launch of the space shuttle, the lowest level launch official, some engineer walking around the launch pad, if he or she sees something wrong, he can cancel the launch. That's something that wouldn't have gone on years ago. And there's no retribution. The idea is that that person has a body of knowledge and knows something and is familiar with the operations and the system and how things function, that he can wave it off. Same thing when the shuttle lands. Nope, can't land in Florida, too rainy. You have to land at Edwards Air Force Base north of LA. That's a decision that a low-level official can make. FEMA, since Hurricane Katrina, which was one of the greatest, not only one of the greatest natural disasters in the 21st and 20th centuries, really collectively, but also one of the greatest policy failures of our time. FEMA really blew it on every level. The entire concept of street-level bureaucracy failed. People in Washington had absolutely no idea and didn't monitor and didn't get information from, basically cut off information from people on the ground. Disregarded it. We know what's going on, don't we? We've been through this before. Kirk, come on. We've been through this so many times. We're experts. We're masters of this. FEMA has now begun to change its tune. Decision-making is much more decentralized, and there's much more effort made in contingency planning. FEMA officials in local areas work much more closely with local government and state government officials than used to be the case before Hurricane Katrina. Will it pay off? We won't know for sure until the next similar disaster comes along. Last year, the oil spill in the Gulf. The Department of the Interior has a bureau called the Mining and Mineral Service. We talked a little bit about the dilemma that this service conflated implementation and evaluation. They were supposed to implement safety regulations, and they were also doing the policy evaluation. And in fact, worse, they actually turned over the implementation to the people that they were supposed to be policing. They allowed the industry to police themselves. It's a classic problem in bureaucracies, and this has since changed. Now, in fact, they're much more closely monitoring situations. They have the ability, again, to veto decisions of their bosses if they think there's a real problem. They can go right to the secretarial level within the Department of the Interior. Again, we won't know how well this has worked until the next problem that we face comes along, but we have good reason to believe that they've learned. I alluded to 3 Mile Island, a nuclear accident many, many decades ago that actually did change energy policy in the United States for better or for worse. There has been no nuclear power plant licensed since 1979. Public opposition is too high. So nuclear power is an option to deal with things like global climate change. Doesn't seem to be very resonant in the United States. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is for you to decide, but every nuclear power plant that's operating was licensed before 1979, including the one down the coast here, San Onofre. You drive by as you go to San Diego. But the NRC has changed its policies. NRC inspectors can shut down a nuclear power plant at the first sign of a problem. And the problem doesn't have to be an operational problem. It can be a problem in environmental reporting. They can read a document that hasn't been filed properly or shows a lack of inspection, and they can shut down the plant. Creates a lot of inconvenience, perhaps, for utilities as well as customers, but better safe than sorry. Common denominators. Well, I could extend this list to another page if I wanted to, but I think this kind of makes the point. Yes, now we have policies and agencies that carry out these policies that are more adaptive. Why? Because of scandal? Somebody did something wrong? A conflict of interest? Because of an accident? Because of a tragedy? A loss of life? A high consequence failure. And I think this is very important to keep in mind and cannot be understated. Because what it says is that policy can change, but unfortunately we don't see a lot of examples of policy changing through long-term planning or anticipation of problems. It's usually a failure that prompts or precipitates a change in organizational procedure, policy process, and policy culture. And I wish I could point to you and say, oh, I know examples of where we haven't had these great failures, losses of property and life. These guys learned it. We don't have those examples. It seems to be the result of a high-profile failure where something really bad happens, or nearly bad happens in the case of 3 Mile Island. Bad enough happens, put it that way. It was bad enough. We don't know if anyone lost their life in 3 Mile Island. It may take years before we know what the health effects of that near accident will be. A lot of people continue to monitor that. Questions?
How do you reconcile then, like at the state level, the issues around like education policy and things where term limits just inevitably cut, us off at the pass because of this temporal, dichotomy. So I don't know how do you weigh, is it better to leave people in office for a longer period of time to get things done in a longer way and then risk not being able to get someone out?
That's a very good question. I mean, that's one of the policy conundrums that we get into with public participation. Opponents of term limits argue that government can only really learn when you have people around for a long time that gain experience, and through that experience can then make better decisions over time. Getting back to the quandary of impatience that I alluded to a few minutes ago, what we see happening is the demand for term limits. Well, we send these guys to Sacramento and they promise we're going to do all this stuff, and then they don't. Then they just want to get reelected. And then they keep doing these stupid things that get us deeper and deeper into debt, don't make good decisions. The only way we can solve this is to put limits on government. That's a very American trait, by the way. It's an impulse. On a positive side, it's an impulse toward democratic accountability. It says we don't want political leaders to be given a long leash. We want to be able to restrain them and control them. And periodically in American society and in other developed democracies, you have this impulse to control or rein in political officials. What that leads to are things like term limits, initiative elections, referenda on policy, things that in fact create greater accountability but may undermine wisdom and experience. That's kind of where we are. I mean, that's not likely to change. On the other hand, in fairness, looking at legislatures, they do have staffs. And those staffs do have an institutional memory, and they're around for a long time. If you've been to Sacramento, those of you who had the opportunity to work at UC Sac Center, internships, or have friends that have done this, frequently you'll work with staff members that have been there for many, many years, and they know the terrain, they know the territory, and these people are trusted. Even by short-term legislators, the legislators do look at these people and say, what about this budget thing? What did we do in '94? How is this a different situation? What can we learn from it? So it's not often as hugely terrible as we think it is. I mean, you can adapt.
Well, the reason I asked is my undergrad roommate, she's been a policy consultant to the Democratic Party for 10 years in education, and she just left and took a job with a corporation, and she, is really struggling because she's really felt, committed to politics, but that she just had to go because she couldn't get anything done. She was education, and she would watch that, come and go, and like the big hurrah around the new lawmaker, and what they do to get elected and the promises they make, and then you have to go through all that. Even though she was a constant, she still felt. I mean, she did things, but still.
I like Winston Churchill's great quote. Many decades ago, late in his political career, he said, democracy is the worst of all forms of government, except for all of the others that come along from time to time.
mean, that's...
As good as it gets.
There's also a story about Churchill that I like. A young candidate for Parliament, running for election as a member of Parliament, came to Churchill, said, I've been wanting to meet you for years. You've inspired me. I just want to be like you. Here are all the things I want to do. And he started enumerating all these policy changes he wants to institute. I want to do this on health, and I want to do this on environment, and I want to do this on foreign policy, and I just want to do all these things. And what should I do first? Churchill turned to him and said, well, I think you should get yourself elected. All right. So, let's look at some future challenges in this context and see if we can tie some of this together. So, three basic claims. When we talk about challenges in public policy, we could enumerate hundreds of them, obviously. But in the context of what we talk about in this course in terms of the policy process, how decisions have been made, harkening back to the very beginning, and trying these things together, let me suggest three big challenges. And I think this is underscored by the readings for this week as well. Let me kind of spell out this first assertion a little bit. Worldwide, we do see evidence that as nation states develop, aspirations for a better life are growing. And this is a worldwide trend. There's lots of data to support this. Expectations are rising. This is true in developing countries. This is true in well-developed countries. This is true in nation states that have democratic political systems with lots of participation. It's true in less developed polities that are still struggling with providing some sort of political order, but I think it's still a valid statement. And as a result, policy problems, and I should really say policy problems and solutions, are kind of converging. They're kind of converging, they're kind of coming together in a number of remarkable ways, two major ways. First of all, and this is something that's underscored by Levin Shapiro, problems are becoming more comparable the world over. I mean, we're seeing it in transatlantic states, we're seeing it in Europe and North America, but we're even seeing it in less developed regions of the world. Healthcare is something that is more and more being demanded, a state role in providing healthcare. We talked about healthcare weeks ago, I know, but as populations age, and as more people come around in populations grow, and as they age, there's more demands for healthcare. There's also demands for more rights for various things. As countries modernize. And what's very interesting, and I think the reading makes a very profound observation about this, how we define rights is becoming an evolutionary process. It used to be that as countries modernized, we would define rights as sort of things that we want the government to leave us alone about. The right to speak our mind, the right to print or write what we want, the right to practice a faith as we wish without somebody telling us what we can and can't believe, the right to express ourselves, liberty, rights from the state. Public policy in terms of rights meant get out of our homes, get out of our private lives, leave us alone, let us express ourselves, speak, write, believe, practice what we wish so long as we're not harming anyone else in the process. Rights were defined in this very sort of minimal way. Now rights are becoming defined as things like, I have a right to health care. I have a right to a clean environment. I have a right to education. This is not something that would simply be nice to have. I gotta have it, or I'm not going to get ahead. And my
field of environmental policy, it's remarkable to see things like the argument that water is a right. That's a growing worldwide phenomenon. Has a lot of merit, quite frankly. Can't do much if you can't have water. Not going to live very long. But the notion that these things are rights. And of course, the subsequent demands that follow this emergence of rights and this emergence of greater needs demands for more what we would call cradle-to-grave protections. From the moment we come into this world to the moment we leave, or even thereafter, okay, we expect, as economies become more complex, that political systems must provide policies in many, 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 many areas. These things are, in fact, leading to, getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but in principle, they're leading to the notion of a thicker state worldwide. That as countries modernize, the demands will be that there be more layers of public policy, more things that government is called upon to do, greater demands for more and more and more. That's one big convergence. But there's another which has kind of opposite or conflicting tendencies. And that is that solutions are becoming comparably constrained. We want more and more and more, but there is also less revenue. As economies change and become more complex, the ability of polities to enact public policies that will do all of these things becomes severely constrained. Both because there are so many demands that all of them can't equally be met within the constraints of revenues that are generated for taxes or fees or fines or whatever. And if policymakers don't respond to these demands effectively enough, there tends to be, as both Ellis and Levin and Shapiro point out, and others that we've looked at this quarter, greater stress placed on policymakers. There tends to be a reduction of trust and a lack of confidence in policy processes. It's an irony. We talked about term limits. One of the ironies is that as demands for more and more from the state grow, more effectiveness, more satisfaction of rights, more provision of protections of various sorts, we have less and less confidence and trust in the ability of the state to do these things well, or to do them at all. It's a dilemma. It's a global dilemma. And it also is exacerbated by the fact that revenues, and I might say other resources, are limited. So here we are. Good place to be. This is a big set of challenges. Questions or comments about this? What do we do? Throw up our hands and say, boy, I'm glad this course is over. Not just kidding. What do we do about this? What can we do? How do you?
Well, not necessarily a solution, but maybe what not to do would be the example that you talked about in the water policy class about Bolivia's privatization. I mean, they were facing pressures not from their people so much as from international organizations like the World Bank. And they made a not very good policy decision in privatizing.
Right.
So I guess just look at examples like that to figure out.
Yeah, and what do you think examples like that tell us? I think that is a good example on a number of layers. I mean, one thing it tells me is that governments need to listen to their people, which sounds kind of trivial, but not so trivial. That, yes, as we globalize, there are more demands, particularly in the developing nations, to listen to international organizations that control economic streams and control the transfers of aid and diffuse innovations and so forth. But it really does kind of go back to old-fashioned retail politics.
First, listen to your population. Listen to what your people are telling you, not what somebody that doesn't even reside in your polity tells you. What else does it tell us? Maybe.
That the government should be controlling a lot, or not a lot, but should be controlling services such as water right or water provision in some countries, and that the private market hasn't developed to the point where it can control that sort of
So
thing.
water is a right,
Yeah.
at least in the opinion of many people. Government has an obligation to provide this service. Does it say anything about how the service should be provided? Or what the government, what the policymakers need to do? Does it say anything about participation? Does it suggest anything about maybe the need for, yeah. It's a good example, and we'll come back to some of the implications of that a little bit later when we talk about public participation within all of this. Yeah. Other comments or questions? So these are sort of some big challenges. So what are some implications? Well, a couple of big implications that can be seen if you harken back to a lot of the case studies we've looked at this quarter. Let me first make a distinction, again, between developing and more developed polities, so we can sort of have a baseline for understanding what's going on. In developing countries, one of the policy implications is that there are greater demands for public participation in decisions. I mean, the example of Bolivian water would be a great example of this. The example of what's happening in the Middle East. Again, it's not just clamoring for democracy, whatever that means. It's participation in decisions that affect people's lives. Less tolerance for authoritarian policymaking. I find this to be a really fascinating phenomenon. The notion that, and we'll come back to this a little bit later, the notion that people in the state are experts. They know what to do. Leave it to them. They'll figure it out. They know what we need, is becoming less acceptable. Greater demands for participation, less tolerance for authoritarian decision-making. It is interesting looking at this from a kind of broad historical context. One never knows how these things will play out, obviously, over time, and the differences in how they'll play out. But when you look at what's going on in the Middle East, you look at the stirrings that are occurring in China, in terms of the government now saying that it understands it has a problem with corruption and understands that there's not a big tolerance among the public for incompetence, and we really need to address these issues. You know, what's kind of lurking beneath the surface, right? How very similar things occurred in Europe and in North America centuries ago. I mean, the American Revolution was, in effect, a revolution in which people said we want more public participation in decisions. The no taxation without representation was a policy statement. And less tolerance for kings and queens and monarchs and distant authoritarian leaders making policy. We want those things to be in our own hands. So this seems to be a more global phenomenon that happens at certain times. And then the second point, in more developed countries, less trust of experts and of an expert state. Greater movement by groups and parties toward the center of the political spectrum. I want to elaborate on that a little bit. One of the interesting things that I think is a dilemma, paradoxical if you will, is that in developing countries where you've not had a big history of participation in policymaking, and you have had authoritarian traditions for long periods of time, one of the concerns is that political systems will move toward extremes. There'll be a rush of demands. There may be a very, very liberal kind of a
polity that takes control, or a very conservative and even repressive polity that takes control. In developed countries, there's a kind of a different phenomenon that's going on. We see it in both Europe and the United States, and in Japan, and in other developed countries. And that is greater movement by interest groups and political parties away from partisan extremes. The parties themselves might not want to admit that. We see this debate going on in Congress, people fighting the last war. But in fact, the public is pretty sick and tired of it. What they're saying is we want movement toward the center for solutions. And what do I mean by the center? Well, by the center, I mean things like we want the government to do all this stuff, but we want it to be done with less red tape, less regulation, more partnership with civil society. We want more innovative solutions that don't just say, this can be done by the state, this can be done by people. It's the state and citizens need to work together in creative ways to get things done. Greater devolution of the implementation of policy from the national level to lower jurisdictions. We see this dilemma in education, we see it in healthcare, we see it in the environment. And finally, more incremental or path-dependent solutions. Healthcare in the United States would be a good example. You don't want revolutionary or radical innovations. No more New Deals. No more New Frontiers. No more wars on whatever. Let's not make war on anything. Let's just do something incremental. Let's see if it works. If not, let's move on to something else. Let's be pragmatic. It's very interesting in 2008, Mr. Obama, I think, in part won election because he was very persuasive toward the center of the electorate in convincing people that whatever solutions would need to be adopted to address issues of health care, the economy, of foreign policy, would need to be found in a centrist view. In fact, one of the criticisms of Mr. Obama, as you know, is that he ran as a centrist, and people moved maybe to the left, or to the liberal base of his party. That may or may not be true, but let me share with you the notion that that's not a unique criticism. Mr. Bush, back in 2000, ran as a centrist on education policies and so forth, and then clearly moved to the right. So this seems to be a kind of a phenomenon that's a constant in policy making. But more incremental or path-developed innovation. And then finally, this last sub-bullet, greater demands for policy thickening in matters of risk. So at the very same time, we talk about moving to the center, becoming less radical, more path-dependent. We still are extremely concerned with issues of environmental protection, health and education, consumer product safety. There has been a relentless growth in these policy areas, and there is not any likelihood that these concerns will shrink or diminish. In fact, in some ways, they've grown into areas that only a few years ago we never could have imagined they could have gone into. Things like a V-chip on your television so you can impede the risk of children being exposed to certain kinds of programs, and that would be the role of the government to provide that policy remedy. And that it would have the consensus of people almost throughout the political spectrum. Those who identify themselves as conservatives will say, that's good because it's freedom of choice. I can determine what my kids will and won't watch. And people on the left could say, this is good because it's the government that's providing this service because the market won't provide it. Cable companies wouldn't provide this voluntarily unless we stepped in and said, you've got to do this. Questions or comments on this?
Just to get that straight, so you say in developing countries there's less tolerance to authority in policy making, but that they accept experts or they trust experts? Is that correct?
That's a good question. No, I think the same lack of trust for the expertise crosses over. What plays out differently is the authoritarianism. The authoritarian tradition is something that still persists in developing countries. So as a result, the rejection of authoritarianism that we see spreading is a kind of new phenomenon. How does that play out in terms of respect for experts or trust of experts? I think it's playing out much the same way it's playing out in developed countries, which is to say a skepticism toward totally expert solutions and trust in people who, through education or experience, consider themselves to be experts, which makes for a common denominator that we'll get to in a little bit, and that is the common denominator of participation, public participation. Spurred different causes, but same set of consequences, more direct public involvement in policy decision-making and decision implementation.
Does that apply mainly to like international aid efforts when they try to modernize developing
Yes.
countries, like foreign countries?
Yes, exactly right, and this is something that's also embedded in this change. Foreign assistance had often been viewed as a kind of paternalism in which it's not just that more developed countries are providing the resources for improvements to health care, improvements to sanitation, improvements to community life, improvements to education and so forth, but that there were strings attached. It was, if you take our assistance, you're also going to get our expertise and you're also going to get our authority. We're going to tell you how to do this because you don't really know how to do it. And we'll teach you how to do it, but then at what point do you say, okay, you know how to do it, we're leaving? Or at what point do you continue the strings? This is sort of what happened in Bolivia with water. And it's sort of what continues to happen in foreign aid programs today and why developing countries, you know, it's interesting how this is played out in the media. It looks like a lack of appreciation. They don't even appreciate all of the aid that we've given them. Well, yes, they appreciate it, but would you appreciate it if someone came in and provided education and a service and then said, and you owe me, and I own you, and I'm going to tell you what to do for the rest of your life, and I'm going to control the strings of your public policy system. And that's kind of where the resentments come in. It's the same resistance to expertise. Again, authoritarianism. And you see this playing out in current activities. You know, what role does the United States play in promoting revolution? It's a very delicate balance. On the one hand, you could say, well, you know, you want to support the changes because they'll lead to more democracy. On the other hand, if you intervene too actively, then you can be criticized for interfering, rather than letting it play out in its own direction.
Well, and one example where it wasn't even so much that it was an intervention that was supposed to, or that was trying to interfere, it was aid in like medical supplies in
Yes.
Haiti has kind of ruined their entire healthcare system because there's so many people offering free healthcare
Yes.
through aid organizations that the people who actually are doctors living in that country can't set up their practices
Yes.
because who would pay for it?
It's an excellent point, and that comes back to these unanticipated consequences of these kinds of change. Let me give you another example. Some of you are familiar with this. Haiti, devastating earthquake a year ago.
At least 300,000 people were killed. We don't really know for sure. Millions of people homeless. Port-au-Prince, the capital and major city, continues to be devastated. People are living in camps. Big problem. How do you recover from a disaster? Well, one of the long-term recovery methods is that people have to have a supply of dependable fresh water that they can maintain and supply for themselves, and food. So what are international aid organizations doing? What have they been doing? Well, the United States, the Agency for International Development, has been providing a lot of grain to Haiti, a lot of food to Haiti, but not a lot of seeds and implements to plant crops, to engage in agriculture, to reforest, to do all of these things that would lead to a self-sufficient economy. It's well intended, but what's happening is we're getting rid of our surplus food, which keeps prices high in the United States. So the farmers are happy, agribusiness is happy. We're, yes, feeding people, but are we building capacity? No. And this is one of the dilemmas. And a lot of aid organizations have said, enough already. We don't want, yes, emergency food. Of course, that's needed. Now the next step is plant crops, become self-sufficient. That's how you build long-term capacity for recovery. So it's another example. Other questions or comments?
Oh, I just want to add that.
Go ahead.
I still just keep coming back to this, what in the world is this going to look like in terms of just the internet technology and how, especially in research, because I work in applied research, and so you see a lot of investigators and informatics specialists and others like meeting in other countries to do planning and research, ideas, especially relative to like genetics and super scientific, futuristic things. And because they go and they meet off from America, they do things, I think, and create systems that are going to, provide information or head legs up vis-a-vis the internet. And because the internet,
including many of these sorts of policy innovations, right?
And I mean, I'm not trying to regulate the internet, but I just feel like if we keep this bureaucracy and the democracy the way it is, it's such a slow process, and that the information and the research is coming out so fast. I don't know how it's going to get reconciled, or where it's
Yeah, and I'm not sure anybody really knows right now how it's going to, what the trajectory will be, but one of the things that we know is that it exacerbates, worsens, makes more apparent this revolution of rising expectations and probably the convergence that we've been talking about. Whereas these things used to take years, maybe decades to occur, they're now occurring in weeks and months. So there does seem to be a compression.
the system just seems
Yeah.
it has to be restructured, I feel like.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
these are kind of accelerating. So we have some challenges, we have some implications. So what are the problems? Or what is the problem? So, a riddle. Didn't want it to be a riddle, but it is. We're simultaneously demanding less harm and greater protection. It's a worldwide phenomenon. That implies more government, more policy, more thickening of the state, more and more of more. Okay? But at the same time, as Ellis and others point out, we're concerned with the fair allocation of benefits and risks. I want a higher quality of life. That means I want to be protected. But I don't want you to tell me how to live my life. And I don't want you to interfere with my privacy. And I want my freedom and my liberty. That implies less of something. We want more, but we want less. In turn, these twin objectives, and I'm not going to leave you with the conclusion necessarily that they are inherently contradictory. Maybe they're not. Let's leave that open for now. Okay? Think about it. On the surface, they certainly seem difficult to reconcile, but that doesn't mean that they're inherently contradictory. Nevertheless, what they do require is a greater reliance on science. Well, if we're going to provide less risk, a reduction of hazard, greater protection, greater levels of nutrition, greater levels of environmental protection, safer and cleaner water, better food supply, more and more of all these good things, these reductions of risk, we're going to need good science. Science and policy have to work together as allies, right? Okay? Everybody's with that? Everybody likes science? Okay, good. You're not anti-intellectual, I'm proud of you. All right. But also an allowance for public participation. Do those two things fit together very well? Let's see, what's a good science? Let's take a vote on it. Determine what the public thinks a good science is. No, that's not quite the way science works. It's not a question of what people vote on or what the majority says. 400 years ago, the majority said the world was flat. Didn't make it so, just meant that's what they believed. So, we have less harm, more liberty. And we have a greater reliance on science and also on public participation. Let me suggest these trends are not going to go away next month, next year, next time this course is taught. Next decade, probably not. These seem to be long-term trends. Can they be reconciled? Well, maybe. Maybe. But they will require that we rethink the role of science in the policy process. And by science, I don't just mean biology or chemistry or physics or engineering sciences. I mean social science, policy analysis, all fields of endeavor that engage in hypothesis testing, the gathering of data, the testing of and generating of theories and so forth, systematic explanations for things. It will require that we have a better understanding of science, and it's also going to require that somehow science be put to public good, and that the public better understand the limitations of science. That's going to require a high level of literacy on public policy issues, on science issues. So in dissecting this a little bit, let me lay out some principles that policy analysts have for years now been struggling with. If you think back to all of the various policy areas that we've talked about in the course, and the tremendous optimism that accompanied the development of policies regarding, say, education, health care, putting people on the moon, insurance programs for retirees, employment training programs, environmental protection. All of these policy areas and more have been animated by a great faith in science. If we could just do some good research, really identify a problem, clearly identify what causes it, what its effects are, and how to change it, then we can hand it off, right? Hand off the ball to the politicians. They'll know what to do because we've told them what to do. And they'll adopt a policy that will improve our schools, improve our nutrition, improve our health care system,
clean up the environment, lessen risk, and do all these magical things that we want. I mean, isn't that what science is good for? Good information, take it, hand it off to the policymakers. They'll make policies and programs that will achieve all of these good things. After all, we can put a person on the moon. We ought to be able to solve the problem with public housing. It's a scientific issue, essentially, right? We just understand the social dynamics of poverty. That's a science, social science. You remember Pruitt-Igoe. Don't have to remind you about that. Well, that's a myth. All of this is a myth. It's not just a myth that was discovered last year. It's been a myth. It is called the loading dock model of science. And it is a model of science that for a long time has been assumed by much of the public in dealing with public policy problems globally. That scientists come up with answers. They pass off those answers to the policymakers, who then adopt them. And then we come up with policies that should work like clockwork. That's why we have universities, for gosh sake. The reality, we now know, after all of this experience with public policies, as we've seen, the use of science by policymakers is much, much more complicated. Science itself is a body of knowledge that is confronted with uncertainties. Scientists may disagree with one another. Experts in general may disagree with one another. Policy analysts who claim, as Beryl Radin argued, who claim to have a systematic way of examining problems may disagree with one another. They may suggest or prescribe or recommend radically divergent diagnoses and radically divergent solutions. And all of those solutions may be faced by uncertainties. And in fact, that is one of the basic characteristics of science. Why are people so frustrated with global climate change as a policy issue? We talked about this a little bit. We will certainly explore this issue next quarter. Politics. It's not black and white. Well, why can't you make up your mind? Why can't you tell us how warm it's going to get? By gosh, you want us to cut our energy use, and you want us to change our whole lifestyle. You want us to stop consuming everything, but you can't even tell us how warm it's going to be in, Palm Springs in 25 years from now. What good are you? You want us to take action, but you can't give us answers. Obviously, your science isn't very good. Now, that's a radical view. Fortunately, it's not a view that's shared by everybody, but you get the picture. The demands that are being made on environmental science, medical science, social sciences, planning, to come up with systematic answers that will be absolute. In science, we consider uncertainty to be a sign of good science. In the policy-making community, we consider uncertainty to mean you don't know. There's a big difference. So there's a policy analysis problem. There's another problem. This word translation, or translating. Scientists are not always particularly adept at translating their work into policy implications. Well, we have found that global annual temperatures may increase between 2 and 5 degrees Celsius over the next 100 years. And
And we think that will influence biological systems in various ways, and water supply in various ways, and habitat in various ways, and sea level rise. So what's the bottom line? What are the policy implications? Well, gosh, you know, I'm not a lawyer. I can't tell you that. I'm a scientist. I don't write treaties. That's what you guys do. Public acceptability, I don't know what the public will accept. That's your job. You're an elected politician. Translating work into policy information. Question, somewhat a rhetorical question. Do you think the flip side of this is that policymakers don't often understand science? How many of you vote for that? Yeah, sure. So it's, when we talk about translation, it's like a foreign language. Part of the problem is how good the conveyor of the information is in interpreting it, but part of the problem is also how good you are as a listener and whether or not you ask the right questions, or even know what questions to ask. And of course, the public has a vague understanding of all sciences, which is an increasing problem. It wouldn't be such a problem if we weren't demanding so much more in terms of the reduction of risk. Can you guarantee that there's absolutely no risk from this new food additive? Well, our studies do not indicate any evidence of real harm. No, you didn't answer my question. Is it safe? That's not the way science always works.
So aren't we,
Go ahead.
aren't we getting at then just like, I mean, the public and policymakers and scientists just finally having to face the music and admit that, you know, they're just not going to know everything and we have to work together. And people are just like crying about that because then they have to deal their fear.
So how do you do that? Now, this is like a triad. You've got science, including social science, planning, all the fields that have systematic body of knowledge, right? You've got science, you've got policymakers, and you've also then got public, right? Now, scientists don't worry much about the public, except, of course, in funding your work. Think about that one. And the public's demands on policymakers for answers and solutions. Policymakers don't understand science very well, but they do understand votes. Okay? So somewhere along the line, you've got to change the way scientists view their role within the policy process. You have to get policymakers to change the way they view the capacity of science to solve problems. And then you also have to somehow get the public to be more astute about both the limitations and advantages of science and the limitations of the policy process in being able to solve all of these problems, including their role in solving problems, right? Not all problems of environmental risk can be solved by passing a law. Some of them have to be addressed by changes in interpersonal behavior, which assume, and we'll come back to this point on Thursday, which assume a phenomenon that we're beginning to call citizen science, which means that one of the goals of future policy has to be not just to teach people about the policy solutions, but to teach people to monitor their own interaction with their environment, not just the natural environment, but everything. To be smarter consumers, to be more cognizant of all of the things out there that can cause harm and how, and what we have to do to avert or prevent. To be able to monitor environmental conditions, to be able to monitor health conditions, to be able to understand what's going on in our schools. That's not going to be easy, but it requires having a kind of a scientific temperament or demeanor. It doesn't help very much.
Wow.
That's kind of where we're going.
So what exactly does it mean translating science into policy? Because I'm reading a lot of
And they're very helpful, aren't they, in explaining how to do it? No,
But what I want to say, and lately, in the end of the paper, scientists usually attempts to say, and the implications to public policy of this research are. Is it an attempt to translate, or is there something else to be involved?
That's a great question. We're gonna get to that. Maybe we'll get a little bit to that today, but we'll get to it on the last day of Thursday. But to answer your question as directly as I can, the problem is that you have these very disparate types of interchange. You have a scientific world in which communication between scientists is relatively easy, right? And academics is relatively easy, right? And you have this policy-making or political world which operates a very different set of dimensions. And then you have the public, which is divided into kind of multiple pockets of interest, right? Let me suggest to you that what you're trying to do is not just translate, which means interpret, but you're also trying to span the boundaries that separate different ways of life. That's a mouthful, but that's really the challenge. It's getting scientists to understand that they are embraced within a larger set of problems that requires them to understand that not everyone can understand the way they do work. So you need scientists who can work with and communicate with policymakers. You need policymakers who can work with scientists. And most of all, you need policy organizations in which these disparate ways of life can coexist. We don't have a lot of that, but there are some things like that as well.
Well, one example of a policy that I think kind of does that is there's a stormwater pollution prevention network down in San Diego that created an iPhone app so that you can take pictures of polluted stormwater and it gets sent to the city who will then try and mediate the problem.
Translational,
Yeah,
boundary spanning, accessible
to some people.
to some people. If you have an iPhone.
So.
But at least in principle, right? Yeah. Accessible, participatory. Right? Yeah. That is getting very close to what we're talking about. That's kind of the future of policy. It also implies organizations that are flat. Talked a little bit about that last week. Come back to that issue. Finally, science doesn't always change things. I mean, we'd like to think it does. But let's face it, changes in society are partly determined by science and scientific predictions, and they're partly determined by social choices, which are anything but predictable. Let me leave you with a final slide to kind of tie some of these issues together at a very practical level. For those of us living in California, you all know AB 32. It's a CO2 emissions strategy for the state of California. And it has a goal. This legislation, when the legislature in Sacramento established this act to reduce CO2 emissions, and when Governor Schwarzenegger, former Governor Schwarzenegger, signed it into law, was based on a number of, can I dare say, assumptions? I just did. Okay. I can't do it. It was based on a number of assumptions. Quite tractable assumptions. That in fact we could reduce within the transportation sector the burning of fossil fuels that would contribute to not only pollutants but to greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane in particular. We could reduce through efficiency standards and municipal conservation programs electricity and natural gas use, which would also lead to reductions in CO2. And methane, which is in fact what natural gas is, it's methane. And methane, by the way, is a greenhouse gas, even if it's not burned. Okay, you understand that? A persistent greenhouse gas. And then through forest conservation, replanting urban forestry parks, we could also achieve reductions in carbon dioxide. And then we would have to do some other things to bring down CO2 emissions, radical changes in transportation, household energy use, and so forth. And then you have a goal. And I like this funnel at the end of the slide because it really underscores the challenges of the state trying to do more, trying to achieve great risk reductions. This is, as you know, a very pioneering effort on the part of California. Very few countries have tried to institute a policy like this, much less states. But in fact, this does connote an increase in measures by the government, a thickening of the role of the state in energy and environmental policies, and not just energy and environmental policies, but in economic development policies, which are embedded in this, correct? Right. This is also going to be a jobs creation program, as you know, intended to be. And it's also an effort to achieve reductions in risk in global climate change. And it's also California's way, I should add, of saying we're not going to wait for Washington to do something. Okay? We're going to do something ourselves. And if it works, we can diffuse the innovation around the world. And other states and regions and countries can adopt these policies. But the funnel at the end is indicative of the quandary that we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes. Uncertainties. If no new actions are taken, greenhouse gases will increase. If some actions are taken in transportation, which is the largest sector in which we can make gains, according to the extrapolation, will bring down greenhouse gases. If we do all of these things that we think we can do, we'll bring down reductions to a point where we're still going to miss the target by some nominal amount. But in all cases, let me leave you with a question. What will determine how well we will approximate or meet or satisfy these various extrapolated targets? Is that a problem of science? Public support? Possibly population growth? Oh, integration of
All of the sectors. I mean,
of all of the
science-
sectors? Okay.
The public has to step up and think it's a good idea.
Okay.
Change the behavior. Science has to be able to translate it.
So you're saying these are social choices? We can tell you what needs to be done. We cannot tell you that it will be done. That's boundary spanning. That's translation. That's getting an understanding of how science contributes to the solution, how policymakers have to use science to contribute to the solution, and most of all, what you and I as the public need to do from the time we get up in the morning or before noon, to address these issues in our personal behavior. Right? This is a classic problem regarding the future of public policy. And we'll come back to this issue, related concerns on Thursday.